poll. Let's go ahead and share the results. So the question, what is the most abundant substance in the body? And everyone selected B, which is water. So excellent, excellent. The most abundant substance in our body is water. Okay, it has a lot of different functions, which we'll talk about throughout this, the duration of the course. And so water is going to be really important, not only in compartmentalizing our body, right, different water compartments, which we'll talk about today, but also in terms of movement through our body, right? We'll talk about absorption, secretion, and so water is going to be a really important substance, and it's the most abundant in our physiology, okay? So let's start here by talking about our first objective, which is really to talk about the distribution of water throughout our body and talk about those various water compartments. So what are the ways that water compartmentalizes our different areas in our body? We're also later going to talk about homeostasis. We're going to define it and then explain why it's important to the function of our anatomy and our physiology. So we'll start with this schematic drawing here on the slide, and this is described as being the minimalist body. That's because it's a really simplistic, kind of overly simplistic, minimalist representation of our physiology. We're not shaped like squares, right? We have, you know, limbs, and so this doesn't look like our body. The proportions are also off, right? So the proportions that we see here are not true, but what we can appreciate is the relative compartmentalization of different parts of our body, the internal environment, and then the external environment. So as we talk about those two environments, the internal environment is the immediate environment of our cells and tissues. This includes our tissue fluid as well as our plasma. And just to kind of simplify plasma, plasma is simply the fluid or watery part of our blood, the watery component to our blood. So if you took all of our blood, removed it from our vasculature, and you sucked all of the cells out of that blood, what's left is our plasma. Okay, so all of this constitutes our internal environment. The fluid that bathes our cells, the plasma that's surrounding our blood vessels, everything that's coming into contact with the environment around our cells. We can contrast that to the external environment. This is everything outside of our body. Not body, let me rephrase that. This is everything outside of the environment around our cells. This also can be inside our body. So it's kind of a weird thing to think about, weird concept to appreciate, but even the inside, the lining of my GI, this is considered external environment. The lining of my lungs, this is also considered external environment. The lining of my urinary tract, my reproductive tract, that is considered the external environment. So wherever we have the lining of our body coming into contact with external, the external environment, so the external air or water in the case of the GI system, that is going to be considered the external environment. Now, between internal and external environment, there's usually what we call an epithelial lining or an epithelial barrier. And an epithelial lining is simply a layer of cells stacked one next to the other that really just separates our internal environment from the external environment around us. Okay, we can think about the surrounding air on our skin, that's external environment. We can think about the air that's within our lungs, that's still considered external environment. The food that's sitting in our GI tract, still the external environment, as well as the urine that's sitting in the bladder. Because it's not within the immediate environment of our cells, we're going to consider that the external environment. Now, although we have two separate compartments generally, we want to appreciate that there is communication between these two compartments. We've got the external compartment communicating via the plasma and tissue fluid to our cells. Now, why do we think this communication is important? Can anyone kind of predict that? Why is this communication important? Why don't I want just a very rigid lining between my GI internal environment and the GI external environment where nothing can get through? Why would that not be ideal? Why do we need to have communication?
Is it so everything like runs smoothly and goes through the body like at a constant pace? Yep,
we can think about it in that way. Yep, so we can have, you know, continuous movement through these regions of our system. Yep. But what else is important about the communication between internal and external environment? Are there things in the external environment that we need to get into the internal environment? There are, right? Think about nutrients from the food that we eat. Think about water. Think about ions, minerals, and vitamins. Think about things that are inside our internal environment that we need to get out, such as carbon dioxide across the lungs. Think about waste products from the breakdown of food that we eat that needs to be eliminated in the urinary system. So there needs to be communication. Although we need to have distinct separate environments or distinct separate compartments, there needs to be communication between both of these compartments in order to facilitate the exchange that allows us to absorb nutrients and oxygen and then release waste such as carbon dioxide, ammonia, which are pretty much breakdown products from our food and from toxins in the environment. Okay.
I also think that, can I add something?
Yep, sure, absolutely.
I also think that there needs to be communication because there are things in the external environment that are dangerous to our bodies. So without that communication, we would be infected with every virus ever. And there needs to be communication between the outside and inside in order to protect ourselves so we can live.
Excellent. That's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up because this explains why, although we want communication, it's not open communication, right? We still have that barrier, that epithelium that we talked about that really acts as you mentioned, a protective barrier, which keeps our environment distinct, but still allows for communication of the things we need. Okay, excellent, excellent point. And so when we think about the exchange that's happening here, they're happening at areas such as the lungs, which we mentioned, across the GI lumen, which we mentioned, and in the kidneys, which we mentioned. Now, we can describe this type of communication as absorption, and we can also describe it as secretion, depending on the direction of movement. So absorption is going to be movement of mainly water and nutrients across the GI tract from external to internal. Whereas secretion is going to be movement of fluid across the GI tract in the opposite direction. So from our cells into the lumen of the GI. And that's also going to be important. So what I want to kind of underscore here is that the communication is not happening in one direction. It's happening bidirectionally, and both of those processes are important. It's important for us to absorb things. It's also important for us to secrete things, either things that we don't want in the urinary system, right, the kind of the waste system of the body, but also to secrete things like mucus and fluid that actually help food and undigested particles move through our GI a lot smoother. Okay. And then we want to think about the movement across the kidneys. There are three processes involved here. There's filtration. And so filtration is simply taking the blood that's in our vessels, as we can kind of see here, squeezing that blood through an apparatus in the kidney, and then kind of filtering the important substance that the body needs and keeping that back, but getting rid of the things that we don't want, along with some water that we don't want. And that's what's created as urine. Now, as a part of fine-tuning that urine, we're going to reabsorb things that accidentally were, filtered out that we want to reclaim, right? That's going to be movement from the urinary tract back into our plasma, back into our blood. And then we're also going to secrete some things that didn't get filtered out, but we don't want them. Other things like other waste products, maybe metabolites from medications and things like that, toxins. And so those can be secreted, and that movement will happen in the opposite direction from our blood back into the urinary system. So again, we can see that movement happening in bidirectional ways to bring about different functions or different effects to either get rid of things that we don't want or to reclaim our important substances, nutrients, and so on. Okay. So that was pretty much the general compartment of our body. Internal environment, what's happening within our cells, external environment, what's happening outside. Let's talk about the fluid compartments. So this is really how the body divides these different water compartments. And so we can think about them being separated also with these epithelial membranes that we described before. Essentially these cells that are stacked against each other to create that barrier. That's really important. And these membranes are usually semi-permeable. And we kind of described a little earlier why they are semi-permeable. So they need to allow some things through that we need, other things in the opposite direction that we don't need, but there is not this open flow of communication. There are some things that cannot get through. So for example, large molecules, they cannot just go through our cell membranes. They need either transporters or carriers or something like that. So there needs to be kind of a selectivity of the movement of substances in either direction. And that's why these membranes are semi-permeable. Okay. And so what we can see here is that the large internal environment has one general fluid compartment that we call total body water. This is all the fluid that's inside our body, okay? Now we can compare that to some of the smaller subcompartments that are within the total body water. All right, so let's kind of describe total body water here a bit. So total body water is all the water as well as the dissolved substances that are found in that water that's within our internal environment. So when we think about total body water, remember, we're not thinking about any fluid in our GI. We're not thinking about any fluid that's being fine-tuned to create urine in the urinary system. We're really thinking about the fluid that is within our internal body environment. And then the dissolved solutes and materials. Now, there are subcompartments within our total body water, and those include the intracellular fluid. And so we think about relating these two schematic diagrams to this schematic diagram, right? We're looking at these subcompartments of all the body water. And so we can divide this into two general compartments, the intracellular fluid compartment. This is the fluid and water that is inside our cells. So in the image here, B, we see that the fluid that is inside our cells, whether that be cells of our tissues, cells of our organs, or the cells in our blood, which are called erythrocytes or red blood cells. All the fluid that's inside our cells is called the intracellular fluid compartment. Also called the cytoplasm or the cytosol when we talk about the organelle and the cellular structures. Let's contrast that to image C, which is the extracellular fluid compartment. This is all the water that is not in our cells. It's going to be outside of our cells. So all the water that is in our internal environment, but outside of our cells, okay? It's still in the body, but it's just not inside the cells. And so there are two further subdivisions of the extracellular fluid compartment. There is the plasma. That's going to be the fluid that surrounds our blood cells within the blood vessels. And so in this schematic here, we're showing this is plasma. I want to point out that while we're saying that this is the fluid that bathes our erythrocytes in our vessels, this is not including the fluid that is actually inside our erythrocytes. That is a part of the intracellular fluid compartment. And then the second subdivision of the extracellular fluid compartment is the interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is the fluid around our tissues or around other cells in the body. So we want to think about all the rest of that fluid that surrounds our organs, surrounds our other cells, the fluid that surrounds our erythrocytes or red blood cells. So all the other fluid that's not inside our vessels and not inside our cells. That's called the interstitial fluid. Okay, let me go back over that one more time. So we've got the total body water, all the fluid in our internal environment. That can be further broken down into the intracellular fluid, all the fluid inside our cells, be it erythrocytes inside our vessels or other cells of the body, organ cells and so on. And then we've got the other general compartment, the extracellular fluid, which is all the fluid outside of the cells. And then that can further be broken down to the plasma, the fluid that's outside the cells, but still in the vessels, or the interstitial fluid, the fluid that's outside the cells, but not within our vessels, just bathing the rest of our tissues and organs. Okay. Let's look at the relative proportions of these water compartments. So, and don't worry about memorizing this, just really understand the relationship at the relative proportions here. So of our total body water, which is traditionally about 42 liters, this can differ depending on different physiology and different states. If you're an athlete, you may have less body water. If you're pregnant, you may have more body water. Elderly typically have less total body water. So this can slightly differ depending on physiology, but generally speaking for healthy males, about 42 liters. And so we look at the breakdown of that 42 liters. A large chunk of that 42 liters is inside our cells, right? The larger chunk, 2/3, so to speak, is within our cells. The rest of that is going to be outside our cells, so about 14 liters. Now, of the extracellular fluid, most of that is interstitial, and a very small amount of that is going to be the plasma. Okay, so I'll kind of go over that relationship again. Of our total body water, more than half of it is inside our cells, inside our organ cells, inside our erythrocytes, our red blood cells. So most of that water is inside the cells. A smaller chunk of that water is going to be in the extracellular fluid. And then if we look even further at the extracellular fluid compartment, most of that water is in the interstitial compartment, which is the fluid that's bathing our cells, not within the vessels. And then an even smaller portion, the smallest portion here of the extracellular fluid is going to be that small amount of fluid that is actually in the cells, outside of the cells, but inside the vessels.